Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And thank you for joining us for this panel discussion, which is the role of empathy in different parenting styles and programs. And this is part of a larger series that we're doing on the role of empathy in parenting and the family in general. And in this panel, we're going to be looking at specifically at different parenting styles and how empathy plays a role in those. And thank you so much to our panelists. What we're going to do here is we'll go around to begin with, and each panelist can introduce themselves, talk a little bit about your work and that you do, as well as any contact information. And then we'll go through a second time and hear from each of you about the role of empathy in the parenting approach that you use. So perhaps we can just jump right in and start at least on my film strip here below. Amy, you're the first. Could you perhaps just get the ball rolling?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Amy Bryant of Parenting Beyond Punishment and Wild Child Counseling. I'm a licensed therapist, and I work with children, adolescents, parents, and educators. And then I also have an online Facebook group called Parenting Beyond Punishment, and it's really a place where parents and other people who work with children can go to get support and encouragement to find out what to do, what they can do rather than punishing their children. And it's really grown to be quite a supportive community. So you can find us on Facebook, or you can go to my website, parentingbeyondpunishment.com.
Thank you, Amy. Kim, you're next on the strip here, and your microphone is muted. Yep, there you go.
Thanks for having me as well. I'm Kim Hopkins. I'm also a licensed social worker, and I'm the director of grants and a trainer for Lives in the Balance, which is the nonprofit that Dr. Ross Greene started to help disseminate his model, which is called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. It used to be called Collaborative Problem Solving. And we also disseminate other non-punitive, respectful models that diverge from traditional discipline. You can find us on the web at www.livesinthebalance.org. We're also on Facebook. Also, our page is called Lives in the Balance. We have an educators Facebook page right now called Lost and Found to help educators who are trying to implement collaborative and proactive solutions in their schools to get support from one another and problem solve. And we're about to launch a parent Facebook group too, hopefully this week, to help parents who are implementing the model in their homes get support.
Thank you, Kim. And next on here is Lori.
Hi there. Sorry, when I talk, I didn't realize it would do that. This is my first time on these things, so forgive me. I'm Lori Petro. I am the founder of Teach Through Love. And Teach Through Love is really an online resource for parents and teachers and communities, really, to spread the message of conscious parenting, peaceful conflict resolution, and definitely non-punitive discipline is a focus. And I really come to this work. I'm a speaker, a parent educator. I have a degree in education. That was one of my former lives as a teacher. But really, I come to this work as a misunderstood kid, and my passion is for healing fractured family relationships and really restoring just peace and respect to that parent-child relationship, which I think is really missing. It was missing from my experience anyway. So Teach Through Love is where you can find me on the web, and also on Facebook. We have a couple of pages on Facebook, the main Facebook page, and then a page where parents can come and get Q&A, questions answered, and it's like a Q&A forum.
Thank you, Lori. Robin?
My name is Robin Peters Bennett, and I am a clinician. I work with children who've been traumatized and also adults who are struggling with the aftermath of early distress in their own childhood. I'm also the founder of StopSpanking.org, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to trying to share the information that we know in terms of research about the damaging effects of spanking children, and also promoting positive discipline, which is how I know these amazing ladies on this panel, because as soon as you say don't spank, a parent's going to say, well, what do I do? And that's the hard road, and that's what these lovely women are doing, promoting more collaborative styles of parenting that are connection-based and attachment-based. And you can find more about my work on StopSpanking.org, and we're also on Facebook.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, I'm Edwin Rutch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, which is cultureofempathy.com, and it's a large resource for building a movement to create more empathy in the world. And I've come to see that the family is perhaps one of the most important areas that we need to work on to create more empathy in society in general. So I'm so pleased to have these illustrious panelists here with all this experience in parenting. So what we wanted to look at, this is our first panel. We're looking at a broad overview of parenting styles. There's so many different styles, from maybe a very authoritarian view to a very empathic approach, and maybe everything in between. So what I thought we could do is go around with each person just sharing what is the parenting style that you advocate for or use or educate around, and what do you see as the role of empathy within that parenting style. And then later on we'll go through some of the other parenting styles maybe a bit more systematically, and talk about the other ones that are out there in society. Is there someone that would like to jump in or to begin with?
I can jump in because
Okay.
I love the parenting style question. I think that we can really get caught up in categorizing ourselves and sort of limiting ourselves in that. But I think for me, it's conscious. My parenting style is conscious. So there really is no set of rules, whether you're authoritative, authoritarian. I think they're just levels of connection that we're really talking about. So when I say conscious, for me, it's about first initiating connection, because that's where problem solving, where self-regulation, where empathy, where all of that will come from, is only when we can start to become conscious. I think a lot of us parent just unconsciously because we're just doing what everybody else is doing. We're not, we were never given that sense of being heard, so we really don't think it's important to kids. So for me, the most important piece is definitely bringing empathy in, but having that first as a parent. You have to have that for yourself if you want to be conscious. So it's a couple of steps in, but I don't like to call it a parenting style. I really like to think of it as just restoring this relational aspect to parenting, and not, because I don't like to tell anybody how to parent. I don't want to tell you what rules to set for your kids, what's important, what values are important to you, but I want to show families how to be conscious, how to not just be reactive in the moment. I grew up with a lot of reactive parenting, so for me it's about just stepping in and slowing down and restoring connection first. And empathy is, the role that it plays is simply, it's the super glue of relationships, empathy. It really is what puts us in that place of being able to be compassionate.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying is that you don't like to actually have these different categories and look at it from a styles perspective, but look at it more from relationship, on how you can create relationship, and empathy is like the core of the relationship building process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Someone else? Amy?
Sure, I'll go. So I really believe in parenting beyond punishment, that when we can step outside those ways that we typically want to do to control children's behavior, and instead recognize that their behavior is communication, that they're really having a hard time and they're really saying, help me, you know, I don't know what else to do, so this is what I'm doing, whatever that behavior might be. And it's really a lot of what Lori said, that we're looking at connecting with our children right where they are so that everybody can become emotionally regulated, and then we can learn something different. So if the child is having a hard time and it's showing in their behavior, once they're emotionally regulated, we can offer them empathy to help them get there and stay emotionally regulated ourselves. Then we can move into a collaborative problem solving with them, for sort of like what Kim does with her in her work. And it's about the relationship. It absolutely has so much empathy involved, both for the child and for yourself and for the situation, that parenting is complicated and relationships are complicated. And if we can say, you know what, I'm having a really hard time, and I can see that you as my child, you're having a really hard time. Let's get to a place where we feel better, and then let's figure out what we can do differently together. And that's really a lot of what we talk about. So instead of trying to control the behavior, we're really focusing on that relationship. And we do it through play and connection and empathy and building skills together, because I didn't get these skills as a child, so I'm really kind of learning them right along with my child, and I think a lot of us as parents are doing that. So.
Okay, thank you. Kim, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think that the role that empathy plays in our model, collaborative and proactive solutions, I think it helps parents and educators to get curious about what's happening. And so we talk a lot about, well, what's your philosophy for why kids are doing what they're doing if they're misbehaving? And we spend a lot of time talking about kind of traditional philosophy versus our philosophy, which is a 180-degree change, because we want folks to connect with being curious about, why is this kid having a hard time right now? And so we build empathy to give that space for parents to, as Lori said, get conscious and stop and think about why this could be happening before they decide how they're going to intervene. So also, the first step in doing CPS is called the empathy step. Ross would say that he would maybe rename it to also add information gathering, because that's actually the goal. But I think you need to be kind of couched and coming from a place of empathy to even initiate the first step, which is a neutral, non-judgmental question, and based on age would vary, along the lines of, wow, you seem to be having a hard time with that. What's up? You know, what's going on? And ideally, we're creating this space for empathy to enter the equation proactively, so we're not always dealing with things in the heat of the moment, because that's not terribly successful much of the time. Although it can be useful for de-escalating, it just doesn't necessarily have a positive long-term effect. So yeah, I would say getting parents to get curious so that they can take a breath and stop and think and ask some neutral, non-judgmental questions or make some observations if their kids are littler, to try to think about what we call them lagging skills, leading to unsolved problems, which is what creates behavior. So starting to create space to think about what those are for their child in this moment.
Thank you. Robin?
Yes, I think everything that these ladies have said is so spot on. You know, that this idea of restoring connection, to me, I'm interested in, you know, world peace, honestly. And I'm interested in ending child abuse, which I believe is a very doable thing. I think that when I was raised, it was thought of as bad weather. It's just part of life. And I actually, in studying the research and working in the field of trauma and understanding neuroscience, is understanding that we create these kinds of parenting styles, and we've invented some parenting practices that are very, very damaging, and they have to do with the bigger picture of trauma of our parents, of our grandparents, of our culture, all over the world, really. And so I think from a perspective of restoration, we're talking about what is the most effective way to grow the brain, to nourish development, so that we have children that have empathy and tolerance and motivation and ambition and love and joy. That's what we all want to experience. We want to be, having loving relationships with our children throughout our life, where they're there. They want to come visit. They want to be with us. They want to call on the phone, not out of obligation, but because of connection, because it is a nourishing relationship. And one thing we know that's so interesting about us as a species is that the brain is very responsive to punishment. It's more responsive to punishment than reward. And so it's a very seductive thing to use when we want to get our way, because you can get immediate response and you can get a very powerful response. But the fascinating research coming out of neuroscience over the last 15 years has taught us that what's even more powerful, even more of an influence, is the power of unconditional positive regard, unconditional love, essentially. And as esoteric as that sounds, it's neurobiologically founded. And so when you really truly have a loving connection, you do several things. One is that you soften or you relax the stress response so the child is not agitated, and this just allows their brain to flourish. And also you activate all of the reward systems in the brain so that the child is more likely to experience pleasure in relationship and much less likely to need alcohol when they're a teenager, to need food, to need high-risk behavior, to need high-risk activities, to feel that I only feel better when I'm taking something in or acquiring something or possessing something. So I think this is a very huge evolutionary development in our culture over the last 15, 20 years, and probably longer than that, in terms of moving away from a materially based drug and alcohol inebriated culture to one of flourishing relationship. And so to me, the most important thing we can be doing is helping mothers and fathers feel supported so that they can have connection and so that they can really understand their children. And empathy, of course, is the foundation to that, because we essentially are our relationships, and little children are mimics. They mirror us. They mirror us.
Oh, thank you. So in terms of looking at parenting and empathy in the family, I'm always interested in kind of getting a broad overview. And one of the first things I did was look on Wikipedia at different parenting styles, and it gives different approaches out there. And one was authoritarian parenting, it mentioned. So I thought maybe we could go through some of those different approaches or styles, and just maybe have an open discussion about what do you think about those approaches, and the role of empathy within them. So within authoritarian parenting, the first thing that comes to me in terms of maybe a program that's along those lines is Focus on the Family. I don't know if you're familiar with that approach. That organization, and I would say my upbringing was more along those lines. I got spanked as a child. It was the family was it was a loving family, but there was it was more authoritarian. To follow the rules, obey, and the focus was not on empathy necessarily, being heard about what was going on for me. So if we could just hear from what are you thinking about, or what are your insights about that authoritarian parenting approach and the role of empathy within it?
I could weigh in. I had sounds like a similar upbringing, very loving home, but there was some spanking. Although I was the youngest of 7 and the youngest by far, I think my parents were tired by the time I came along, so I didn't receive as much as the others. But I got the wait till your father gets home quite a bit. Mm-hmm. For me, what ended up being missed in that parenting style was that I had a major lagging skill around cognitive flexibility and a change when the plan changed. So I can remember, being told, okay, we're going to go roller skating, and then at the last minute the plan changes and now we're going to the movies, and I I perfectly like going to the movies. In fact, if you asked me, I'd probably say I like the movies better than roller skating, but I would have a hard time and I would melt down, cry about it, and it was read as, well, she just likes her own way and dealt with that way, as opposed to, let's take a breath and get curious, what could be troubling for her here? Oh, it's a change in plan. That's what's hard. It's hard for her to make that shift cognitively and give me some skills so that it's not so hard. Because then as an adult, especially when I became a manager and had to put fires out all the time, I would have a really hard time with that. And I wasn't doing any major behavior of it, but I would become anxious and it would come out as like snappy, which doesn't really work in the context of a personal relationship. And so I could be viewed as unhelpful or rigid or something like that. So I think flexibility, and like we've talked about, those breathing moments, the taking the time to think through, I think expectations are fantastic, especially the realistic kind. So it's all in how you pursue the expectations that aren't being met. That's really critical. And if empathy can be part of how you're pursuing the expectations that aren't met, then I think you've got something going there.
I can speak to the authoritarian as well. I think there's obviously definitely a difference between authoritative and authoritarian, and I grew up in the authoritarian, which I really didn't have any voice. So authoritarian to me is not even authoritative, where there may be punishment, where there may be even no voice, but it's more a parent that seeks to control every aspect. That's how I see authoritarian. That's how I felt it. And so for me, whenever I look at, or whenever I'm helping parents or looking at my own child's behavior and the negative behavior, trying to figure it out, I always look at 3 areas: skills, stress, and the state of the relationship. So authoritarian for me, just like Kim was saying, it impacted my skills, my communication skills, my ability to be flexible, my ability to self-regulate, and not having a voice, being shut down with punishment, with physical there was a lot of physical punishment. I come from culturally accepted violence, and I'm not talking just like spankings. I mean like backhanded across the face without warning kind of stuff. So it was very, it made me hypervigilant. It made me very just hypervigilant, alert to what was going to happen. And then I also found out when I was about 38 that I grew up with undiagnosed Asperger's. So for me, there was this piece that people didn't understand my emotional expression. Some people will say, oh, these kids don't show it. And I'm going to say that the adults in my life didn't understand it. So the authoritarian, on top of this special need, or whatever we want to call it these days, difference, learning style, brain difference, whatever we might call it, it impacted me on several levels. So the skills, the state of the relationship. People thought I was being rude or just, like Kim was saying, wanting to get my way. But I got accused of a lot of disrespect, because that disrespect that was coming at me and through this authoritarian parenting, for me, I was so sensitive that I just melted down and reacted very strongly back to it. Some kids might shut down and you might not see that emotional neglect that's going on, and some kids will act out. And I kind of did both, but I definitely acted out. So I became very aggressive with my siblings. That was another impact that it had, and they were much, much younger than me, 6 and 7 years younger. And so now I was a teenager, unable to control my emotions with very small children. And so it caused a lot of problems in those relationships. So I think it affected me on all of those levels: my skills, my stress, what I could tolerate, and the relationship that I had with my parents and with other people around me. And this authoritarian, I think definitely there is a cultural impact. I think immigrants were much more likely to be authoritarian because it was survival based. So, and like Robin was saying, we invented a lot of parenting strategies based on our needs, based on what we were trying to achieve in those moments. So that's my view on the authoritarian and what it impacts. I mean, I think that's definitely the most damaging in terms of what it does to our a child's resilience and their ability to sort of take in life, experience it, and roll with it, really be able to bounce back.
Yes, I really resonate with what Lori's talking about in my own upbringing. My parents were very devout religiously, and in some ways that was their strength, but what came with that was also a preoccupation with being bad and being good. And what happens when you're kind of an anxious person anyway, maybe you came from a violent upbringing or a very strict upbringing that makes you kind of reactive, then when you're with your children, you become very worried that they're going to be bad, and you react, and you can react very aggressively and not even realize it. And for me, I was often quite afraid of being bad, and I think at the root of it, the aggressive, angry, either yelling or hitting, all of that sort of authoritarian approach, it was, I was supposed to show respect even when I couldn't, even when I was overwhelmed. And the underlying piece of it is just feeling that I'm a bad person, I'm unlovable, and feeling a lot of hatred that could never be expressed. And so I think that's the other piece of it, is that if we treat children in a way that if we treated our friends, they would no longer be our friends, or our husband would no longer marry us, they would be out of there, then we have to think about, okay, well, those are sort of common, it's a common idea about being a human being. Why would we treat children differently? And I think it's ultimately shame. An authoritarian parent is usually afraid they're a bad parent and afraid their children are going to be bad. And instead, I think it's better to be concerned if children feel bad. If they feel bad, then we try to understand why they're struggling, instead of are they a bad person, which is more of a moral judgment.
Thanks. We're not hearing you, Amy.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
I had it on mute because of my dog. Yes, I was also raised in a very authoritarian religious family, spanking and groundings and lots of love too. I mean, without a doubt, in conversations as an adult now, they say, we did a lot of what we did because we were afraid we would get in trouble if we didn't, or we were afraid we were disobeying God if we didn't. And that was a huge point of contention for us for years, as I'm sure most of y'all can relate. But what I have learned is that with growing up without having a voice, I had to find a new voice that wasn't just about being angry, and it wasn't just about someone has to hear me somewhere, but like, what is that voice? Developing more empathy and compassion for people instead of just sitting in that anger that I wasn't allowed to express. It's so much of this growing up as an adult instead of learning these things as children that I think we all want our children to learn. And, I just, one of the things that sticks out for me is because it was that whole good, bad thing, like Robin mentioned, that I just remember sort of going through this, my parents think that this is bad, but I don't think this is bad, so I'm just going to get sneaky and lie because I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. And so I got really good at it, and then my parents thought I was so good, and so I wasn't the black sheep until I got older, right? So, and now we've sort of healed, and we've figured it out, and I don't think I'm really the black sheep anymore. We'll have to ask them and find out. But, empathy has been a hard thing, I think, to learn because it wasn't modeled. And compassion has been a hard thing to learn. And honesty and integrity, like, it's okay for me to be honest and say, I think this is good, and so this is who I am. I'm presenting that to people. Our authentic selves, my authentic voice. And I mean, so many things. Flexibility, like what Kim was talking about. When you don't have a voice and you have to obey authority or you're afraid you're going to get hurt, you don't get to learn those key skills. You don't get to learn impulse control, and you don't get to learn emotional regulation and having an authentic voice. And I think we all want that for our children. I think universally we want our children to be able to make decisions that are good for themselves and for other people, and have compassion and have respect for themselves and others. And I can't see how that can possibly happen in an authoritarian household where children have no voice.
Well, this is so interesting to me that I did a documentary on my family history, and my parents come from the eastern part of Germany. And part of the documentary, they talked about their upbringing, and they talked about the switch, which was up above the door, and which, I mean, they literally had, got spanked with switches, so it was very authoritarian there too. So there's this, goes from one generation to the next, and what I'm seeing here is everyone here had that, somewhat of that background, and is looking for an alternative. So that's really quite fascinating to me. So the next approach was that I saw here was the authoritative parenting, and I'm not even clear what that really is. If anyone wants to jump in and explain that parenting approach.
I think that's when we take the extreme hitting out of the authoritarian, and we keep the control, and we rename it. But it is getting a little better with each generation, right?
Yeah.
Not some parents, because I have friends that have that same authoritarian upbringing, and they don't hit their kids, but they're still really authoritative, and that's really where I see most people sort of hang out and get stuck if they don't really pay any attention to it. If their kids aren't causing enough problems where it's disrupting the whole family or disrupting school, and it's sort of we can deal with a certain level of negativity from our kids and our parents, and so that that builds up. But authoritative, I think, really just means I'm going to keep control, but I'm going to do it in a way where I'm not where it doesn't fall under the terms of abuse, which hitting and things do now. It's really that's my take on authoritative.
I love it, Lori. It's like I sort of think of it, this whole adverse childhood experiences study. You can get this score from 0 to 10 depending on the kind of adversity you have. And I always think the higher your score, the more dysregulated you usually are, and mine's pretty high. So I just think it's like how upset I am on the continuum, how stable or not stable is my environment. But the modality is still one of authoritative. My authority is threatened, so I have to protect it. And it really fundamentally is a lack of trust in love and lack of trust in relationship, and just really how incredible, like with Kim Bett's work that she's talking about with Ross Green, one of the things they talk about is just being able to get in there and solve the problem together, as if you're going on a plane ride, I think was one of the analogies he had one time, and you don't really know where you're going to end up. You want to go to Hawaii, your child wants to go to the Bahamas, but you don't know where you're going to end up, and you can't in the back of your head go, I already know where we're going to go. I'm just going to get my way, and I'm going to be a really good listener, but we're going to Hawaii. I mean, so that to me is authoritative. It's like if you've still got your frontal lobe going, you can be kind of tricky, which, I think we're all guilty of that at certain times. I've had to really work very hard on that myself, personally.
Absolutely. I think that sometimes the focus is so strictly on, I have to teach my kid right from wrong. And punishment's not the only way to do that. Also, if we're so restrictive in that thinking, what we could actually be teaching is blind adherence to authority, with no thought process and no thinking and no problem solving that takes place. And a lot of folks I'll run into will say, well, when they get out into the big bad world, that's what they need to know. They need to know when to put their head down and say yes ma'am, no ma'am, or yes sir, no sir. And when we think about it, and I've kind of done an informal poll of many adults, that's actually not our experience as adults. We all have bosses. Sometimes maybe we've been stopped for speeding or something like that, had to deal with the police. And it's not always black and white. And there's often room to say, can you tell me where you're coming from? Here's where I'm coming from. Can we get together on this? And so I think taking the plane ride, and that's exactly one of the symbols we use, is really helpful because it teaches your child to problem solve. And those are the skills that they really need most of the time in their adult life.
Yeah. I'm on. you know, the one thing that I think that stands out for me most for both authoritative and authoritarian is there still just seems to be so much fear around our role as an authority figure, and sort of that idea that if I'm not in control, I'm either a schmuck or all chaos is going to break loose. You know, we have this sort of, if your kids are having a hard time, parents want, people around you want you to come down on your kids. There's that fear of what are people thinking, or this fear of my kid is controlling me, or I'm not strong enough or smart enough. And I think what we're looking for with empathic-based parenting is to say, I have some fears. I have some fears that I'm not doing this right, or I have some fears that my kids, you know, maybe a little out of control in this one moment or several moments through their lifetime. And it's just, it's having empathy for yourself in those moments, and having empathy for your parent, for your child in those moments, that moves you out of those authoritative and authoritarian roles, so that we're not afraid of not having our thumb down on our children. And I don't know, I agree with all of what y'all have said. There is some differences, but there's still not a lot of empathy, I don't think, for what's going on, and certainly not a lot of understanding for the for where our children are and what's going on for them on the inside.
And don't you think, Amy, it goes back to what I think you were saying this earlier, which I completely agree with, that we focus on behavior. So authoritarian and authoritative, they both focus on stopping behaviors, whereas empathic parenting or conscious parenting focuses on solutions. Are we building skills? Are we restoring connection in our relationship? Are we helping the child regulate stress? What are we really focusing on? And when we're focusing on those root causes, we can see beyond the behavior. But those two, they don't allow for any taking into consideration what's going on internally.
Yeah.
And that's so important to stopping behavior and to really addressing it, is to know what's going on internally. And those two approaches are so, it's a hierarchy at that point. It's the parents at the top, and we have the rules, and we have to make all the decisions, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Lori, I think about like this idea of knowing what's going on inside. I'm thinking like that's how I actually manage my behavior. Like, I'm paying attention to all of you, but I'm also tracking myself. Like, how am I feeling? What's going on inside of me? What do I need? What is influencing what's occurring? And then from there, I'm able to connect to you and have a relationship. And I think that's a learned behavior. And when you grow up in a home where your internal world is not investigated, then you don't know how to do that. And I think that's why psychotherapy is such a huge business, because you have to go somewhere and learn how to pay attention to yourself inside. And you'd really do that through, like what Carl Rogers, famous psychologist, said, through the therapist giving you unconditional positive regard. And that's essentially reparenting us because of the deficits that our parents, didn't know how to give and probably didn't receive themselves.
It's so interesting what you were saying, Robin, because that tracking of your emotions and your even the sensations in your body. Why do I feel this way? What am I listening to? What am I hearing? For kids that have experienced trauma, and I know for myself, restoring that connection to what was going on took a long time, because they lose that. When we shut down kids in that emotional part of themselves, they lose that awareness, that body awareness, and that's what really creates this rigid inflexibility in a lot of kids, because they completely lose touch with that. So just hearing about that was such a huge part of my trauma releasing work through Dr. Peter Levine and his work, was noticing those sensations, was reconnecting to my body in that way, and being able to process as I was listening to people, and really, instead of numbing out, when some people might do it with addiction, some people might just do it by shutting down completely. So that was just really interesting to hear that. and such an important part of this parenting piece.
Yeah, and for those that don't know about Peter Levine, he is very interested in the bodily experience, and it's not just useful for trauma, which of course many of us may not feel traumatized, but we do carry a lot of anxiety, or we get a little down more than we need to, and life's hard, or our relationships are maybe have a lot of conflict. And the beauty of his work is he's in the body, and really I think that starts with toddlers in such a big way, like understanding what it is to be in their body. What is their body experience? Body experience is so fundamental to having any orientation to what's going on and being able to connect to other people.
Well, I didn't want to cover some of the other headings that I saw there about the topology of parenting. The one that came up next was indulgent parenting or permissive. Would you like to jump in on that? What you see that as being? Describe your thoughts on that and the role of empathy. I think sometimes a more empathic form of parenting or family life is seen as maybe indulgent and permissive. It gets confused sometimes between the two.
I think it's the other side of authoritarian parenting, and I think it comes from the same place, being raised in a family where there is a lot of negation of your being, of what you experience, of what you think, and probably a lot of aggression, either overtly expressed through anger and hitting, or not overtly expressed through just negative looks. I just give them a look and they're in the line. There's a lot of parents that say, I never have to hit, I just give them the look, but it's the same attitude. And so some of us are fighters. We'll mouth off and fight back, and they call that externalizing, and we're problem kids. And some of us are more, girls are often more this way. We're more passive. We dissociate, we fade out, we go away, we become passive, and we learn that to submit and to be passive is the best way to cope with aggressive situations where we're threatened, where we're small. And so I think permissive parenting is just a passive response, a submissive response to life, to anything. And so, of course, you relate to your children the way you learned to relate in your upbringing, which for many of us, to avoid aggression and to avoid getting in trouble, being passive and just letting things go was, and not speaking up, was the way we survived.
Well, I really like that description. I think that makes so much sense, because when I work with parents, I sort of find that that's exactly what happens. They sort of don't know what to do, and they feel overwhelmed, and so they just go kind of like, whatever. And then at some point, they might do the opposite. They've gone whatever for so long that they just explode. And then they're caught between these two, exploding or coming down hard and, just letting things go. And it's, in some ways I think there's more empathy there, but I think it's also related to our own experiences and how we've worked through, or perhaps not all the way worked through them, to figure out how to have a voice. I think that I really like that description. I think that makes so much sense.
Yeah, it definitely is the other end of the other end of the spectrum there in terms of authoritarian. And I also agree. I love the way it's not just about wanting to give your kids too much. It's about not knowing how to cope, and that really is your way of coping. And I think I have a lot of parents that come to me, and they will give in because they don't know what to do if they're not yelling or punishing, and to stop the crying or to stop the whining or the begging or whatever is coming out emotionally from their child that they can't tolerate. They need to find something to do with this. They need to find a way to cope. So I think they're just, those parenting styles that we call them are just the adult's way of coping with what's going on in the situation. And indulgent parenting, I think it gets, people say, well, if you're not punishing, then you're indulging. And we really can set boundaries without being unkind, and we can do it without being aggressive or reactive, just in the same way as we cannot set those boundaries kindly. We can be kindly indulgent. That's not going to be any better for our children. But conscious parenting, empathic parenting, it should not be equated with indulgence or permissiveness, and I think it is often, but that's because people don't really understand that we're not going to be just addressing behavior. We're going to be going for the root causes. And so sometimes that looks like we're ignoring the behavior. And if we can help people understand that we just want to go a little bit deeper, and that going deeper gives you, I'm about sustainable discipline. I know a lot of people don't even like that word, discipline, but for me it's about giving people sustainable tools that have long-term impact, and not, and for me, authoritarian, indulgent, whatever, authoritative, they all have short-term benefits maybe, because we get that behavior to shift in the moment, but it still affects the long-term ability of our children to cope, manage, whatever it is.
I agree. There are a lot of families that we work with who are permissive now didn't end up starting that way when they describe how they envisioned parenting and then how it actually played out. That when parents have a challenging child who has a big behavior, that's what they do to just get it to stop, just like Laurie said. And what we like to do is kind of help parents see that there's a middle, that there's a way to have expectations and pursue those expectations that doesn't have the likelihood of increasing behavior, and in fact over time will decrease it. And parents, the light bulb goes on, like, wow, help me understand that. And we also work with schools who come across permissive parents to plant the seed that maybe that's not how they want to be, and maybe they just don't know what else to do, so that they can see their role as working with parents, if they know something else to do, to work with them from that respect and not blame them that, well, that parent just doesn't care enough to set limits. That's not the case in most of the families that we work with. No, they care a lot. They just don't know what else to do. And I think a lot of the influences that we'll be talking about in another panel in media, a lot of places that folks turn to learn parenting just tell them to do more of the same authoritarian stuff, and they're saying, well, I've tried that. I've been very creative in my punishing, and it's actually made things worse. So they don't know what else to do, so they sort of stop pursuing expectations. So.
Okay, so another approach that I saw here was called neglectful parenting or uninvolved. I don't know if that overlaps with permissive, or is that just a whole different approach?
I think it's pretty different. I mean, to me, I really like how Alfie Kohn talks about this, and I think he talked about it with you, Robin, in an interview last year, and based on his book called The Lie or the Myth of the Spoiled Child. He says that there's a clear difference between sort of an indulgent or permissive parent and a parent who's totally uninvolved, because the uninvolved parent is the one who's doing their own thing and doesn't know what's going on. And again, it's not maybe not necessarily because they don't want to be, but maybe they're overwhelmed with life. They're at work and they can't even think about checking in on their child, or for whatever reason, they've got other things going on, which I think is different than the permissive or indulgent parent, because they want to be involved and they don't know what to do, and they're overwhelmed and they're shutting down. So it's almost, in my mind anyway, and I can't say it as eloquently as Alfie Kohn would probably say it very clearly and strongly, that the difference, I think, is one is trying to be involved and doesn't know what to do, and the other is absent. It's like an absent parent. And I think there's room for all of us to have empathy for all of these parents who are struggling, whether they're permissive or indulgent or authoritative or authoritarian or absent.
Definitely. I think sometimes... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Robin.
I was just going to say I thought that was pretty eloquent.
It helped me, too. I understood what you were saying, Amy. I think that neglectful can also be the parent who is giving their kid everything, but emotionally they don't see it. They think that giving them classes and making sure they have the nicest clothes and making sure that they look good to the outside can overtake, and then they completely forget to check in. You know, their child may come home with sort of a down look, and they don't say, you know, hey, how are you? Are you okay? They just say, oh, you know, your snack's on the kitchen table. Make sure you do your homework, and I'll, you know, get ready for sports. And they sort of check out emotionally, but that doesn't mean that they're checked out totally, whereas a permissive parent might be totally checked out too. So I think there obviously is a spectrum. And what Amy said about that support, when we stop labeling ourselves and when we stop sort of classifying these habits and these patterns that we've gotten into, we can then start to come together and support. When we stop pointing fingers and saying, oh, she's permissive and he's authoritarian, we can then look to parents' deeper needs, and when we can show them that we care about them and we're not just criticizing and judging, because I think so many parents fall into these habitual patterns because there's a lot of judgment out there in society of not just the kids but of what parents are doing, and they don't want to look like they're the parent that's, you know, going to have the kid that falls through the cracks, or the kid that's going to go and cause some disruption and some you know, negative behaviors and all that kind of thing. But I think there's a spectrum of all these labels that we have, but if we can come together and really support parents, we can change the family structure and the way that we relate to each other, the way that we think it's supposed to be, that we're supposed to be relating to each other.
So actually get away from this labeling, which we're doing here, because and
really
really empathize with every form, and say that every approach that someone is using, we can empathize with them and see what the needs are underneath there.
Absolutely.
Oh, Robin, or did you?
No, I was just thinking that I thought we were really close to the top of the hour, is just sort of where I'm at right now. And I wonder if there's any closing remarks that anyone needs to make before we pop off the show.
I really enjoyed when we were speaking about parents having empathy for themselves. I think that's really important, because I was thinking when you were just bringing up blaming of parents of all types. I mean, I think about there was a school system who wanted to fine parents for their children's behavior at school. Like, there's some really entrenched blaming going on, and I'm not sure that parents are going to be able to demonstrate empathy for their kids if they're feeling that weight on them. So I appreciated that comment, in addition to many others, but that really stood out for me.
I appreciate this entire panel discussion. I think we all have very similar approaches to children, and I think it's very much about empathy for children and child advocacy, but also empathy for parents, because we were all children who perhaps weren't parented perfectly because our parents weren't parented perfectly and their parents weren't parented perfectly. So I think this is an exciting discussion, the entire thing.
Laurie, or any closing remarks?
No, I agree. I enjoyed it very much. I think that when we can restore the family unit as, and I'm not saying that it's not whole, but I believe it's very fractured, and I believe that we are, you know, we're filling in those cracks. We are shoring up our foundation and just giving people a voice, I think, is so important. And empathy is the crux of all that. Being able to say, I hear and understand you, it's life-changing. It's been life-changing for me, so that's why I'm so excited to. And I love that we all come from different perspectives. I mean, we have, you know, licensed clinical people that know their stuff, and then, you know, for me, I really do, even though I was a teacher and I'm a parent educator, for me, I come to this work as a misunderstood kid, and that just fuels my desire to help parents, not just, you know, restore that relationship, but the relationship with themselves as well.
Yes, I think, the idea of empathy is that I feel you. I feel what it is to be you. And when I hear, Laura, you talk about your own experience, it's like I'm in there, I'm feeling it. And I know when someone feels me, and I just relax, and life is better, and it just doesn't hurt as much. And I think what we're healing here is the disconnectedness that we have as a tribe. And it's not just about parents, it's about our whole tribe. It's about giving connection and love to the whole tribe so that we all can just take a breath and know we're going to be okay because we have each other and we're not alone.
Okay, thank you. So I feel a little remiss here. There was a couple more style approaches that we didn't cover: attachment parenting, nurturant parenting, and empathic parenting. So we ran out of time, but we're going to be doing a whole series of panels. I hope we can cover those in future panels, as well as. So I want to say that the main thing I feel is that if we're doing empathic family, empathic way of being, it means to empathize with everyone, and the means are the end. So it's not about judging any parenting style, but to empathize with everyone, and it's by empathizing that we model how we create that empathic world. So with that, I want to thank you all. This was a wonderful discussion, and I'm looking forward to our next one as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.